Hi, everyone. I hope that we're having a good, calm, not too stressful last couple of weeks of the semester. If you haven't noticed, we are actually pretty much towards the end. We've got this week and then one more week of content, and then it's the final exam. Stuff is over. Which being in an online setting can kind of make that seem a little bit surreal and out of the place, or out of place and confusing. And then thinking about quarantine and the coronavirus and everything that's happening, and you're just like, I have no sense of time, the world, or anything anymore. So that's where we end up, which becomes kind of interesting. So this week, we're taking our discussions of the public and our discussions of the visual, and we're kind of looking at them in the context of uncivil and non-deliberative engagement, and we're looking at protest. So that makes for kind of an interesting move and transition to an alternative perspective to a lot of what we've been looking at so far. So your assigned readings for this week are Chapter 9 in the Polcheski, Eisen, Fritsch book, as well as two articles, the Deliberative Democracy article by Iris Young and the Public Sphere to Public Screens article by DeLuca and Peoples. There was a third article on the syllabus, but as I was trying to get access for articles for everyone, I realized we only have that in print in the library, and there's not a digital version available that I could find easily for everyone. So I just cut that from our readings for the week. So don't try and find that article. Just do the chapter and the two articles that I uploaded to iCollege for you. So as you're getting into Chapter 9 and reading through it, this is your self-check moment for what we've been reading. We've been reading a lot of articles that address specific aspects of this chapter, and now this chapter is kind of doing that summary and that connection of the key terms and vocabulary that you're needing to reference, and giving you that kind of conception and perspective of what it means to think about rhetoric, argumentation, and deliberative engagement through our relationship to the public and these ideas of counterpublics. So as you're reading the chapter and some of those things, I want you to be asking yourself, like, are some of these things starting to click for you? Are you seeing the relationship between this chapter and some of the readings that we've done? If the answer to that is no, then we should have a one-on-one meeting before you try and take this final exam, because that means that you're going to end up struggling on the final exam if you're not seeing some of these connections yet. And we need to figure out a strategy to help you with that. As well as I want us to think about what some of the kind of key framing concepts are. So this is another moment where you get a different definition of the public, because Polcheski, Eisen, Fritsch define the public as people coming together to discuss common concerns, including concerns about who they are and what they should do, and as a result, constructing social reality together. And they're telling us that publics, one, there are multiple publics, and we have different terminology to reference the different kinds of publics that exist. But two, what is consistent across these publics is that publics use rhetoric, and publics establish grounds and standards for argumentation. So this gets us thinking about why we're talking about publics and public spheres and public engagements as issues of communication, as issues of rhetoric, and as issues of argumentation. So work through the different terminologies as you're framing your definitions, your key terminologies, and put them in connection to each other. So how do strong, weak, and hybrid publics interact with each other? What might be the relationship between a strong public and counterpublics, or publics and counterpublics? And why do we think about enclaved versus oscillating publics when we start talking about counterpublics? What are the differences of some of those as you're moving through them? And then as we start thinking about that, you can move into the Iris Young article about deliberative democracy and think about what roles and what positions might we put the deliberative Democrat and the activist into when we think about our different kinds of publics. Where do they exist? Do they have a place in our terminology? And then you can start unpacking what's happening. So they are constructed as these ideal versions, which means that they are giving the best possible argument from each side, and it is not really representative of what happens in the real world, how we engage, who the real deliberative Democrat is versus the real activist, right? Like, and how they would interact with each other. So you're given these two roles. You've got the deliberative Democrat. These are parties to political conflict. The core belief of the deliberative Democrat, right? What frames the deliberative Democrat's idea is this belief that parties to political conflict ought to deliberate with one another through reasonable argument. Reasonable argument becomes kind of the most important term for them. The deliberative Democrat is the character that we've kind of been imagining throughout the semester. This is the person that uses the Toulmin model of argumentation, that thinks about the defining parameters of the different spheres of the public, who engages in proper syllogistic argumentation, right, in that proper back and forth that we've kind of been theorizing as good versus bad argument throughout the semester. This is all kind of building up into this idea, character, or identity of the deliberative Democrat. Now what we're getting introduced to is this character of the activist. And the activist remains suspicious of exhortations or of calls to deliberate, because the activist believes that in the real world, these norms of deliberation are biased in favor of those who are in power. So essentially what we have been thinking about and the way that we have been theorizing argumentation throughout the semester forecloses access to deliberation and argumentation for those who are marginalized or oppressed. So the thing that I would like you to try and do and figure out is, how do these arguments for deliberation versus activism unfold in that dichotomy of those in power versus those who are oppressed or marginalized or experience marginalization? Is this a good dichotomy that we should be thinking about? Where are those connecting to frustrations, concerns, or arguments that you have been forming about argumentation, about deliberation, and about public engagement throughout the semester? So from this, we're given kind of two primary charges of the deliberative Democrat. Those charges are that activists are irrational nihilists who bring a bad name to good causes. And the second is that activists are unreasonable because they're not willing to listen to those that you believe are wrong. So activists are irrational nihilist jerks who kill good causes because they're unwilling to talk to people that they disagree with. That is the core of the argument of the deliberative Democrat. The activist responds to those two primary claims with two positions. One, that in fact they're not partisan, but their interests are universal and they're focused on the redressing of harm. And then two, that deliberative Democrats think that reasonability or reasonableness is very narrow. and instead, reasonable should mean having a sense of different forms or alternative forms of action and an ability to kind of defend the strategies and tactics that you're taking. So from engaging these two primary causes, Young gets us to think, okay, it's universalist causes, not partisan. Reasonability should be expanded a little bit. So now let's look at the 4 big challenges that activists make against deliberative democracy. Those 4 challenges are: 1, deliberative procedures are exclusive because they are the activities of the elite. 2, when engaged in formal inclusion, it's not enough because these inclusive processes have structural biases and essentially make decisions about whose voice is worthy of attention. So even when you include marginalized groups and marginalized individuals, they're not getting the same amount of screen time coverage as those who are in positions of power and those who have the ability to exclude them. And then 3rd, so even if you have redressed issues of formal inclusion and the exclusiveness of activities of the elite, these existing social and economic structures set unacceptable constraints on the terms of deliberation. So they set a bunch of rules and parameters of what counts as evidence, what counts as engagement, etc., and that becomes unacceptable for their engagement. And then finally, the 4th one is that even if you are able to remove the structural, social, and economic barriers, the discourse itself is hegemonic and exclusive. The discourse is designed to be manipulative and to produce false agreements because the activists don't know the language, or that language itself is already set up to exclude them, to fail them, to move forward. What I'm going to task you with, if you would like to do some prep for the exam on this, is, so you've got these 4 arguments. You should hopefully be able to kind of map those in the article itself. Now, what I want you to do is map out what the responses the deliberative Democrat has to those 4 arguments, and then come down on whether or not that is possible. Is deliberative democratic engagement possible for the activist, or is alternative forms of activism, or are alternative forms of activism important and necessary for marginalized groups? So take those 4 challenges, that deliberative procedures are exclusive, that formal inclusion is not enough, that there are too many social and economic structures, and that the structures of discourse are hegemonic, and map out what the responses from deliberative Democrats would be. And then, and figure out where you might come to a conclusion on these arguments. Now, as you're doing that, and as we're thinking about that, we're given, both in the Young article and in the DeLuca and Peoples article, a case study or an example of protest that can be helpful for us to start thinking about this. So DeLuca and Peoples take up the Seattle protest as our example of protest and this moment of transformation for American deliberative society. So this moment of transformation is a move away from the notion of the public sphere towards this notion or concept of the public screen. So what are we talking about here? So we're introduced to this concept of the public screen. And in the public screen, we're looking at dissemination. We're looking at visuals. We're looking at hypermediacy. We're looking at publicity, distraction, and dissent. In the public sphere, you're looking at rationality, embodied conversations, consensus, and civility. So they are related to each other, right? And we're reimagining the public away from the public sphere and towards the public screen. And the reason for this is because if we only look at the public sphere and these discourses of rationality, embodied conversation, consensus, and civility, what you see is a very limited notion of the public and this belief that the public has been completely eroded by mass media and completely eroded by the introduction of television and entertainment because it makes us all disinterested in civic public life. DeLuca and Peoples are saying, not quite. And in fact, there is something valuable happening in this era or age of the public screen because the screen brings the issues of democratic deliberation and the issues of democracy in crisis into the home. Now it's just a question of figuring out how we engage, how we get people's attention, how we participate. And for them, they have identified that in the age and era of the public screen, where it's about dissemination and it's about visual engagement and it's about the speed of circulation and it's about how easily distracted we are as viewers and engagers to incite and encourage participation in democracy, you need image events. You need these tools that are designed for mass media and become important forms of citizen participation. Because if the media is saturated, it's hard to garner attention. So you need something kind of shocking. You need something that's going to gain attention. And if you go back to the chapter on visual rhetoric in the book, you're given a definition of image events, and you can unpack the Greenpeace case to see what an image event is. And now we're understanding even more so why image events become so important for protest and so important for protest rhetoric, because without them, protests don't get the media attention. This then directs us to perhaps the most controversial part of this article. So most people who in the academic space who read this article and read the case of the Seattle protests in '99 against the World Trade Organization as an endorsement of violence as a necessary aspect of protest. So the question I have for you is violence necessary for protesters to garner attention? And if so, because the case of Seattle says maybe, and it says maybe for two reasons. One is when the protests were just peaceful, uncivil disobedience. That's the words that DeLuca and people use. When it's just peaceful, uncivil disobedience in those first days, there's almost no media coverage of the thousands of people who showed up to protest the WTO. However, when anarchists become involved and there is violence to property that occurs, and that's important. They're speaking of a specific and particular kind of violence, and that is violence to property. Then there's a more than 25% uptick in media coverage for two reasons. One is the nomer of it bleeds, it leads. Violence becomes newsworthy because it can hold attention and generate viewers. And two, because in fact, the entire time there was violence happening at the Seattle protests, but that violence was on the behalf of the police. causing violence to the peaceful, uncivil disobeyers. So when the anarchists start performing acts of property violence in Seattle, the media now has a narrative to characterize the violence. Police violence is reactive to anarchist violence, and the anarchists can be characterized as the bad guys who ruined this wonderful, peaceful protest. But at the same time, not that many people knew about the protests, even though there were thousands upon thousands of people in Seattle, because the news wasn't covering it. So you're stuck in this kind of interesting paradox that I want you to find a contemporary example to unpack. Is violence necessary for protests to be considered successful? And if so, what does successful mean? And does that make violence justified? Does that make violence a form of participatory engagement in democracy? Does that make us participatory citizens if we use violence during protests? I don't know. I imagine this will be a place on our final exam where I might encourage you to make a decision about the status or the role of violence in protests in its relationship to deliberative democracy. All right, well, that's what I've got for you all today. This is the last reminder. So Wednesday, you're going to have a quiz. It's going to become available on iCollege Wednesday morning, and it'll be available until 11:59 p.m. Wednesday night. Let me know if you have questions. Reach out to me. I'll be up for my office hours on Friday.